through infected urine, urine of an infected animal, feces of an infected animal, or even the milk of an infected animal can transmit the foot and mouth disease to an healthy animal. So what are the symptoms of the foot and mouth diseases? First, salivation. The animal begins to salivate. You see saliva just coming out of the mouth of the animal uncontrollably. Then you see vesicles on tongue and feet, that is blisters. Then another symptom of foot and mouth disease is lameness. Lameness, the animal will not be able to walk because the leg is affected. Fever, inflammation of the teeth and the udder, that's the mammary gland is inflamed, that is swollen. Then loss of weight, the animal will have lost weight. What the animals that are infected by this disease are all domestic animals. Domestic animals generally are infected by this foot and mouth disease. How do we control it? First is segregation. Once you notice an animal that is affected by foot and mouth disease, just separate it from other ones so that you don't have all your animals infected. So you first separate the infected animal. Then good sanitation is another thing. When you take good care of them, there is cleanness around the animals, then you are able to control the foot and mouth disease. Then vaccination, that is, you immunize the animals against this even before the infection so that they don't get infected, or even after. Once you discover these symptoms in your animal, just call your veterinary doctor. Another way to control this disease is to burn and bury contaminated materials like their urine, their fecal material, milk and wool, for you just bury it or you burn it so that other animals don't get in contact with the contaminated materials and become infected. The next viral disease is the contagious bovine pneumonia. It is also caused by a virus, and the mode of transmission include direct contact with material, contaminated material, direct contact with the animal or with contaminated material. So once an healthy animal gets in direct contact with the infected animal or with the materials from the infected animal, the animal will get infected. The symptoms: first is frequent pains. The animal will experience frequent pains. Then subdued cough. The cough won't come out well. So you just something like a cough that is not really coming out well. That's another symptom. Then prolonged untriefness is another symptom of contagious bovine pneumonia. How do we control this? First is annual vaccination. You should not joke with giving your animals adequate care if you don't want them to just waste away, disease come and attack them and just clear them out. So you vaccinate them annually against this disease. Then the next control is that you slaughter affected animal so that it doesn't spread the disease to other animal. Once you notice it in an animal, just eliminate that particular infected animal. The next viral disease I'll be talking about is the rinderpest or the cattle plague. It is called rinderpest or cattle plague. The causal organism is also a virus, and it is also transmitted by direct contact or materials that are contaminated with discharge from lesions or wounds from the infected animal will also infect an healthy animal. Another way of transmitting this disease is contaminated food. Once the food is contaminated by an infected animal, it's water, urine, or fecal material. When an healthy animal gets in contact with this contaminated feed, water, urine, and feces, the animal becomes infected. The symptoms of rinderpest or cattle plague have high fever, the blood is stained, it has diarrhea, that is stooling, and the stool has blood stains in it. Then it has mouth lesions, that is wounds all over the mouth. The the animal loses appetite, it doesn't want to eat anymore, is weak. Because it can't eat, then the animal becomes weak. Then it has respiratory problem. Then you notice that the animal starts to die. Once your head is affected or infected by this disease, then you notice high mortality. Animals begin to die one after the other. How do we prevent or control rinderpest? First is vaccination. Vaccination is very, very important in animal husbandry, so you don't joke with that. Then the next is isolation of infected animal. Once you see that an animal is infected, it's just behaving funny, it's not performing its psychological activity or physiological activities very well, you just isolate it to check so that it doesn't affect or infect other animals before you know it. Another way to prevent or control rinderpest is to quarantine newly introduced animals. We talked about when we're talking about animal breeding that once you are introducing a new animal or plant species, you first take them to the quarantine. You don't just bring an animal from a foreign country and just introduce them into your country like that. No, you take them to the quarantine, so they check it for you. The animal goes through quarantine test and is certified. Once the animal is certified, then it's safe for you. That's the way to prevent the spread of rinderpest. Another way is that you slaughter and bury infected animal. Once you see that this animal is infected and is not yielding to treatment, just slaughter it and bury it so that it doesn't get to infect other animals. Then you restrict the infected animal's movement, isolate it from other animals. The next is the Newcastle disease. It's also caused by a virus, and the mode of transmission is also direct contact or with contaminated material. Once an animal has direct contact with an infected animal or the materials from that infected animal, the animal will become infected. The symptoms have sudden death. Sudden death is a symptom that you just discover that you didn't notice any strange thing about this animal before, just discover that it's dead. Then sometimes you see stringy discharge from the beak, that's in poultry. Then the animal begins to shake his head, it begins to turn his head, then you suspect Newcastle disease. Then the animal stretches his neck too, stretches his neck, prostration. Then another symptom is diarrhea, then loss of appetite. The poultry doesn't want to feed anymore. Then it begins to have a cycling movement, moving around a circle like that. So that's an indication of a Newcastle disease. How do you control Newcastle disease? Vaccination. Vaccination is very important. I've emphasized that. Then maintenance of good hygiene. Make sure where your poultry are staying is very neat. You don't have to leave their fecal material, their urine and everything messed up. No, make sure you maintain good hygiene. Then you slaughter, burn and bury infected animal. Once an animal is infected, just slaughter it, burn and bury it so that it doesn't affect other birds. Then you should disinfect your poultry house. Once you notice that, just disinfect it. Use some chemicals to disinfect the poultry house. You can use disinfectants. We have a lot of them, so you disinfect your poultry house. The next viral disease is Ebola disease. It's also called the mad cow disease. Ebola disease or the mad cow disease. It's also caused by a virus. Mode of transmission, first is by direct contact with an infected animal. Then contact with contaminated feed, or once an animal feeds on a contaminated feed or water. Another mode of transmission is when there is overcrowding. The animals are just so much in the herd, and they are just flocking and rolling on one another, just brushing one another. That will lead to a transmission of a disease like the Ebola disease. And symptoms, the madness in animal. You observe the animal starts to misbehave, like it has a psychological problem. That is seen in cow. So that's why it's called a mad cow disease. Then the brain is damaged. The brain of the animal is damaged. Then we have it loses function, and it sometimes leads to death. How do we control Ebola disease or the mad cow disease? First, you restrict infected animal. Just isolate it before you deal with other things. Before you know it, the other animals will be infected. So isolate infected animals, then slaughter infected animals. Just make sure you slaughter infected animal, burn and bury the dead animal. If it's died of its own accord, burn and bury it. But if it's not dead yet, you can restrict the infected animal, isolate it. Later you can slaughter it, then quarantine. Or before you introduce new animal, make sure you take them to the quarantine so that it will be certified safe or disease-free for your herd. Then the next viral disease is a chronic respiratory disease, also called CRD. Causal organism is a virus. Mode of transmission is by direct contact, overcrowding, contaminated feed and water with nasal discharge. Because it's a respiratory disease, the animal has nasal discharge. So once its feed and its water is contaminated with that nasal discharge, any animal that feeds on that same water or feed will get infected. Then another way of transmitting this disease is improper